so that we're able to put this up on our Facebook page at a later time. So I think, oh, and with questions, Michelle has said that feel free to ask questions along the way or put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring the chat box and I can flag those to you, Michelle, as we go along. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it straight over to you and leave it up to you.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Bob. So it's always, yeah, Bob and I have known each other for quite a few years, and I have a lot of admiration for his gardening and his gardening skills. And so I've been lucky to learn over the years from him about that. So I think there's been a lot of good mutual learning about gardening and bees between his family and me. I've actually spoken at some of the St. Margaret's Bay upskilling events in the past, and I always do something a little bit different. I know that we have 90 minutes, but I find that especially when we're doing things online, it's actually really challenging for me to kind of estimate how much we'll go through in a certain amount of time. Sometimes people are really engaged and ask a lot of questions, and other evenings it's just very quiet and I get through things very quickly. So I just want to let you know there is a lot of time for questions throughout. In fact, that's kind of how I like to work. Oh, and I should share my screen here. Sorry, I forgot to do that. Okay, I think about everything where I can see you and find my stuff. And I just need to make sure I can see the chat box. It's the other thing I have not done. Whoops.
And Michelle, I can keep an eye on the chat box for you as well.
Okay, that actually might be a better idea. So why don't you just do that, and then just stop me when there are questions. But I am actually very happy to hear from you in person if you have something that you want to ask about. So so anyway, we're going to talk about upskilling with natural beekeeping, and I thought I would just let you know a little bit about who I am in terms of my own beekeeping path. I'm a biologist as well as a beekeeper, and I think perhaps because I have a background in entomology, I kind of connected with bees a little bit differently than many people do. I've had an apiary for 8 years. Actually, it might be 8 or 9 years now, up in Cole Harbour. And I've kept anywhere from 8 to 16 hives, and sold bees for sale, sold honey and crafts and beeswax and so forth. And at some point along the way, I just, I had never thought of myself as a teacher, but I just felt really compelled to share. This has just been such a huge, huge addition to my life. I mean, beekeeping has just enriched my life so much. And I think they're just such incredible creatures that I just wanted to start sharing with people about that. And so I now have this very small business where I'm giving courses on beekeeping and wild bees and bee conservation. And it's definitely a labor of love for me. So I thought that my general, I'm going to hit on quite a few different things in this talk, since we do have 90 minutes. And I just thought that some of you would have different interests in different things. So I'll start off by talking about what bees are experiencing in the world, just as they go about their daily business. Answer the question of how are the bees doing? That's usually what everybody wants to know. And so I can speak a little bit about honeybees and wild bees there. And then we can sort of identify what those differences are. I'm not going to give you very much about wild bees in this seminar, because my thought based on the title was that you wanted to hear more about honeybees and beekeeping, but you're welcome to ask questions. And then I'll just describe the natural beekeeping in a nutshell and tell you what you're going to be getting into. Give you kind of an overview of what beekeeping really is like, and what you'd end up needing to learn about if you decide that this is something that would really suit you in your life and something that you really want to do. So I hope that sounds like what you're looking for. There are quite a few people in the group, otherwise I would stop and ask you what you would hope to hear about, just so I could emphasize certain points. But why don't I just start going through it and And then you can feel free to just put up your hand and ask me a question if anything strikes your fancy or if you want to clarify something. So we'll start by looking at bees in the world. And I think the story here, I think, what most people think about when they think about beekeeping or think about the bees being in trouble or the bees disappearing is kind of a past reference to something that was happening much earlier in the 2000s, which you've probably heard about. It was called colony collapse disorder. And colony collapse disorder is really no longer operating at this point. It really hit the American beekeeping industry really badly. So they lost, gosh, well over 50% of the beehives in the United States during the time period. And colony collapse disorder it's associated with a very specific set of symptoms. So it's not just like a general disorder that all hives can get or that all hives are getting all over the world. This was something that happened kind of very, very locally in the United States in that time period. So not every honeybee hive that's dying at this point has colony collapse disorder. But it did have a really severe impact on the American beekeepers and on the industry. And to this day, scientists think it probably had a combination of causes. They didn't manage to isolate a single thing that, was very clearly causing honeybee colonies to collapse. So it's been very interesting, I guess. I mean, devastating, but interesting. And the research is continuing on why it may have occurred. Interestingly enough, actually, it wasn't a big deal up here in Canada. So we didn't experience it nearly to the extent that the American beekeepers did. However, bees, obviously are facing a lot of stresses in agricultural areas. And, this photograph looks really beautiful, but it's a picture of the almond orchards down in California. So California produces most of the world's almonds. Like other, large crops, it's grown as a monoculture, which means that we're just growing a single plant over a really large amount of space. And, they look lovely, they look well managed. But if you look at this picture closely, you can see that almond blossoms are the only thing that's available in this whole landscape, right? There are no other flowers there. So once the almond blossoms are gone, then there isn't going to be anything else for the bees to forage on here. And this is actually just the fact that we're growing our food this way in these large monocultures is really why the whole migratory beekeeping industry evolved. It's because we need to put a lot of honeybees or a lot of bees into an area like this for a short period of time. And then when the flowers are gone, we have to truck them to a different place where a different crop is starting to bloom. So large scale beekeeping has kind of evolved along with our practices of doing big agriculture this year. And migratory beekeeping is really stressful on bees. It's stressful because during the transportation, they can die, they can get overheated, sometimes the trucks overturn. But then also when they're in this environment, the bees are experiencing things like all the pesticides that we use, and also nutritional stress because they're only able to feed on a single thing. So it's the way we do agriculture is really hard on bees. I'll just say that and leave it there. It's probably not a surprise to any of you. So as I said, monocultures can result in poor nutrition for bees, a lot of stress, a lot of exposure to agrochemicals. And, on top of that, bees are also experiencing increasing habitat loss in the world, where we're starting to eliminate green or natural areas. Bees also experience a lot of disease, a lot of parasites, and then of course, climate change is acting on top of all of this. So all of these pressures are acting in both rural and urban environments to different extents. And so I think the question of, well, how are honeybees managing? How are any of the bees managing in this situation is very relevant because we know how important they are. Now, interestingly enough, honeybees are actually doing better than most people think they are. The prevalent story has been that all the colonies are disappearing, the honeybees are in trouble, and actually they're coping. They're coping in some ways. For example, the number of honeybee colonies that we have across Canada and in Nova Scotia has never been higher than it is now. So we have a lot of colonies. We do still have a lot of honeybee death over winter. So that's certainly, a big factor in honeybee keeping, is whether or not your bees survive. And then, of course, all the pressures that I just mentioned are also increasing all the time. So the way I like to sum up this situation is just to say that, we don't have a problem with the number of honeybee colonies that we have right now, but we have a lot of bee health problems that are embedded in a much larger unsustainable agriculture problem. And I think that that's something that Transition St. Margaret's Bay talks about a lot, and is certainly part of the move towards having people grow more of their own food and so forth. So we have, we grow our food unsustainably, and the way we keep bees is kind of enmeshed in that, and that's where the problems really lie. Now, I said that I would talk a little bit about the difference between honeybees and wild bees. And so I'll start with honeybees, since that's going to be the main bee that we're talking about today. Honeybees are really, really beautiful insects. They exist in colonies of tens of thousands of bees. They're very intelligent. They're extremely social, to the point that their colonies are actually called superorganisms. They are our primary agricultural bees because, as I said, we can move them around to pollinate different crops. And we can do that because we keep them in artificial hives, right? So they're very important for pollination within the monoculture system. And, but of course, beyond that, honeybee colonies contain so many different nutritious, medicinal, and special substances. We're all familiar with honey, familiar with beeswax, but you can also harvest medicinal substances like propolis and, gosh, what else? Honey, beeswax, propolis. I think that's most of it. Yeah.
Well, how about pollen, Michelle?
Oh, sorry, pollen. Of course, I knew I was missing something. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, you can harvest pollen too. And so, in fact, people used to keep honeybee colonies and consider them as medicine chests. So not just as a source of food, but actually as a source of all these medicinal products. And people still use them today, which I think is really cool. I am just going to go grab a cough drop. That's the one thing I forgot to get with me. So just give me 1 second.
And some people are still joining in. That's great to see. Thank you. I would like to ask you to go on mute when you join in. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I forgot about the cough drops. So for those of you who are new, you haven't missed very much. I'm Michelle McPherson, and we're talking about natural beekeeping today. But I just started off by giving some broader context about what honeybees are experiencing in the world, and how the practices of honeybee keeping have kind of evolved along with monoculture agriculture. But now we're talking about what makes honeybees special and what makes wild bees special. So to continue with honeybees here, the reason they're called honeybees is pretty obvious. They harvest nectar from flowers and they bring it back to the colony, and that's what they turn into honey. And the reason honeybees make honey is so that the colony will have food when the flowers aren't blooming. And this was a really major adaptation for honeybees, because it means that honeybees can actually overwinter as an entire colony, and they're just about the only bees to do so. Most of our wild bees will actually die out for the most part over the winter, and only the queens or only the pupae will kind of emerge the following spring. So honeybees are really special in that sense, that they can actually continue on as colonies throughout cold periods or dry periods, and it's because they make honey. So the other thing they gather from flowers when they're pollinating flowers is the pollen, of course. And the reason honeybees, the reason why they gather pollen is because it's very protein rich, and they bring that back to their nests and use it to feed their young. So if you're looking, did anybody have a question? No, okay. So if you look at this photograph here, which is just so incredibly rich looking, you can see there's sort of a light yellow band at the top. And basically what you're looking at there is the honey that the bees have made, and they've sealed it up with wax. So they put a wax capping over it to preserve it, and they will basically, break in and start using up that honey during the winter when they need it. You can also see a lot of the cells, the honeycomb cells containing an orange substance, and that's the pollen that the bees are bringing back, and they use that to feed their young. So I like to call these ones pantry frames. So as special as honeybees are, and as much as I love them, it's kind of interesting for me as both a biologist and a beekeeper, because I feel like sometimes I'm wearing two different hats. Where I love the craft of apiculture. I love getting into a hive, and it's just, it's such a privilege to have such a close-up look at what this honeybee society is doing. And yet as an ecologist, then my thoughts are back with the wild bees, because the wild bees are the ones that belong to our ecosystems. Honeybees were actually introduced to North America, so they're not a native species, but we have all these wild bees here that, have a place in the ecosystems. They are also extremely important for crop pollination, although they tend to be undervalued. And all the wild bees are facing, the same threats as honeybees. So they're facing the habitat loss, they're facing agrochemical use, they're facing the effects of climate change. And then beyond that, wild bees can also get parasites and diseases from honeybees. And so that's one of the reasons why I focus so much on honeybee health when I'm teaching beekeeping, because I definitely, as a small scale beekeeper, I would never want, my own colonies to pose any kind of problem for the wild bee populations. That's something that I think is really important. So here's a wild bee that most of you would recognize. It's a little bumblebee. This one here is actually a tricolored bumblebee. I'm pretty sure all of you have seen them. Very common, very cute little bees. And so the bumblebees are some of the wild bees that we have here. And we have more than 200 species of wild bees in Nova Scotia, which is just amazing. 15 of them are bumblebees. We have 15 different types of bumblebees. I haven't even seen them all. I think I've seen 5 of them pretty commonly in this area. The bumblebees are very social bees as well. They form small colonies like the honeybees do. But bumblebee colonies don't overwinter because they're not creating any kind of nest architecture that stores honey for them to eat over the winter. So bumblebee colonies will die off except for the queens. And other than that, most of the wild bees are called solitary bees. And basically that's just like a single female bee kind of acting on her own to build a little nest tunnel or something like that. And then, laying a few larvae and then making sure that they have some provisions. So all of these wild solitary bees would live in places like they'd live in the ground, they would live in plant stems, they'd live in rotting wood, tufts of grass. Basically the corner of your property or yard that you just haven't gotten around to yet, that little corner that you've left kind of wild, or that wood pile that you haven't tidied up. Those are wonderful spots for wild bees. So I hope you'll just leave them in place or learn more about how you can cultivate that kind of wildness in your property. As I said, the wild bees are very important pollinators for many, even of our food crops, as well as being the pollinators that kind of match all of our native plants as well. Just a quick question. Were any of you aware of this at all? Like the difference between honeybees and wild bees? Anybody?
Yeah, in general, I've got a little house on my deck that holds the ones that dig in the little tunnels.
Oh, okay. Like the mason bee houses?
Yes, yes.
Awesome. Yeah,
nobody's lived in it yet.
Pardon me?
Nobody has moved in yet. It's been 2 years.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. Yeah. I didn't want to present, in talks like this, it's hard, I didn't want to present too much and make I just didn't want to present, like over present too much material. So I'm not going to say anything more about native bees or or gardening for native bees. However, that is a topic I really love. And I'll just mention that if any of you belong to, a garden group out there, if you have a garden group who likes to invite speakers to talk about wild bees and gardening, then feel free to reach out to me, and maybe I can give you a talk just on that topic. So today we'll focus on honeybees, but I did just want to open up some awareness for some of you who may not have realized the difference between honeybees and wild bees. Anyway,
Yeah,
sorry, was there any question?
Michelle, there's a question from Eva in the chat box along the same lines about what are some of the effects that honeybees may have on our native bees? Since honeybees aren't native to North America.
Yeah.
Hi,
Well,
that was me who asked. Sorry, I just wanted to note that I'm asking that as a fellow beekeeper, and I have known the difference between the honeybees and the bumblebees. It's only recently really been driven home to me, though, that they're not native. Like there's no native honeybee to North America.
No.
And I mean, I've always tried to plant around my location to hopefully suit both types. So that's why I was asking. But anyway, that's where I'm coming from as well.
That's lovely. And that actually, when I teach courses about honey beekeeping, like longer workshops and courses, that is exactly what I hope that beekeepers will sort of come to, is just that honeybees will be kind of like an entry into the bigger bee world, and that people will become sort of so enchanted, with their honeybees, that they'll start noticing other bee life and just feel kind of less afraid of wild bees, just more comfortable around them, and then start cultivating better conditions for them. So I'm really, really happy to hear that that's been your experience, and that's
it's actually
motivation.
It's completely changed.
Yes.
How I even look at the weeds that are in the ditches that are growing. So
perfect.
It does change everything. I do encourage people to take courses, Yeah.
That's
anyway,
perfect.
That's enough. I'm muting again.
That's perfect. And, when I said that, it can be challenging for me to sort of wear the two hats of being an ecologist and being a beekeeper, ultimately, I just hope that, through honey beekeeping, people will actually become better ecologists. And so I'm very happy to hear that that's where you're coming from. Anyway, to answer your question, certainly honeybees can spread some of the parasites that they have to wild bees and also to wasps. So varroa mites and deformed wing virus, I believe, are the ones that have been documented in bumblebees and possibly even in wasps. And nosema can transfer. So these are just some of the parasitic infections that honeybees can get. The other thing would be just, that honeybees compete with wild bees for resources, right? I mean, honeybees compete for wild bees with wild bees for pollen and for nectar. And I don't think anybody, like scientifically, nobody really, we don't really know, to what extent that's happening, or if it even really is a genuine problem as opposed to just being a theoretical one. So I think for now, the way I think about it is that, I won't keep very many hives relative to, the amount of bee forage in my area. So, where I have bees in Cole Harbour, there's actually a great deal for them to eat. And so I don't mind putting, 8 hives within a large meadow or large field situation in Cole Harbour. Like there's so much nectar and the bees make so much honey that I know there's a lot there for wild bees as well. But environments where, the nectar and the pollen might be scarcer, I might kind of rethink how many hives I'm keeping, and but I can't really give you any kind of real scientific information about how many that should be in what place and so forth. It's just kind of how I try to think about it and work with it myself. So I'm afraid that's all I can give you. Nice to hear from you. Thank you. So with that, I guess now I'm going to talk a little bit about keeping honeybees, and just say that, there really are a lot of compelling reasons to keep honeybees. And I think that, if you're like me and you went through the pandemic and you found yourself really thinking about food security, or maybe even worrying a little bit about food security, you might have thought about beekeeping as being something that you'd like to try. Maybe you just have a sense that you'd like to connect to the natural world through bees. And certainly, even though honeybees are introduced, I think they can be a wonderful introduction to the larger world of the larger bee world, and the ecology around your hives. I think a lot of people also get a sense of, like, a real sense of well-being as they're working their hives. And that is true as well. It can be, I think one of the best things about beekeeping is that it really slows you down. You have to really focus when you're at that hive. And so people find that it can kind of ease their stress a bit, even for that hour that they spend with the bees. So there is a well-being component to it too. And then, of course, those of us who do keep a couple of hives in an area where we can, the bees can collect and make surplus honey. Obviously, it's really rewarding to collect, a little bit of honey at the end of the season and have some for your own use, and possibly even enough for friends and family. So there are a lot of reasons to keep honeybees. And I'm curious to know if any of you have any other reasons as well. Any motivations that I may not have listed.
Michelle, I could jump in.
Sure.
When as a beekeeper of 1 or 2 hives, it's the phenomenon. You've got your bee suit on, you've got the smoke kind of drifting in the background from the smoker, you've got the hive open. You're in a cloud of bees.
Yeah.
And there's that light buzz going on, and the energy of the whole thing is just phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
Really is.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think when I came to honey beekeeping, it was actually after I had done a lot of research on other insects. And so I spent like many summers in Newfoundland wearing like basically a bug jacket to keep me from being eaten alive. And so for me, like, I got so used to it that I never had that like even awareness, or like it just didn't faze me to have like bees flying all over the place. Like it just wasn't something I noticed. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because it would be pretty amazing. Yeah, to be able to feel all that. I think that's great. Thank you. Anyway, I'm sure you all have reasons of your own. And I practice something called natural beekeeping, which is a little bit different from the way other people approach beekeeping. Certainly different from the way commercial beekeepers would approach beekeeping. But I'm not faulting commercial beekeepers for that, because they have very different aims. I'm sorry. Basically, when I say I'm a natural beekeeper, I'm trying to put the care and the stewardship of the bees as my top priority. So this would be, before I anticipated having any kind of honey for myself or any reward for myself. It's just kind of like a practice where I assist the bees to flourish, like kind of in their own right. And I think with natural beekeeping, there's just a lot of respect for the colony organism itself, just really wanting to work with it to maintain a sense of integrity of the organism and respect their natural processes. Something else I do is I really like to let the bees eat their own natural foods as much as possible. So I always try to under harvest so that there's more honey for the bees themselves. And another thing about natural beekeeping is that, because you're putting the welfare of the colony first, you're always thinking about winter and making sure that the bees have what they need to overwinter successfully. And so I often say that, winter survival is like my beekeeping North Star. And because I'm always thinking about it, and my goal is always to make sure that my bees get through the winter, my bees do get through the winter. Like it's just having that perspective and that way of looking and working with honeybees that just allows more success. And of course, when your honeybees are thriving and flourishing, then that's also much more satisfying for the beekeeper as well. So in practice with natural beekeeping, some of the things I do is that I like to use more natural materials with my hives. So that means wood and wax. I avoid plastic because it's less sustainable, obviously, but the bees don't like it as much either. I've always been very mindful about making sure that I'm sourcing kind of locally adapted bees. So I'm not buying bees that have been imported. Most of the honeybees for sale are actually imported. They come from New Zealand or Chile or Hawaii. And those are much different climates than what we have here. We have a much longer, colder winter. And so having like a good locally adapted bee stock, like good local queens, means that your bees are hardier right from the get-go. Another thing that I like to do is just be really, really proactive about colony health. So that's something that I really emphasize with all my all my courses, not just how do you work with parasites and diseases, but just how do you create healthy conditions for the colony. Natural beekeeping has a lot of respect for queen bees. And one of my favorite stories actually is about Bob and Susan's own beehive, where I think they had a queen for 4 years, which is just unheard of. I mean, usually people consider queen bees to have like a 2-year life cycle or 2-year lifespan. And so it was really quite amazing that they had a colony whose queen just kind of kept surviving happily and kept laying. And I think Susan in particular, like, went through a period where you guys weren't sure whether you should replace the queen before winter, because there was a question about, well, would this queen actually live through another winter? And if she wasn't going to live through the winter, then the whole colony would probably end up dying. And in the end, I think Susan decided not to replace her. And I thought that was really sweet, actually. It was just kind of like, no, this is such a strong queen. She's done so well for us. And, if she goes, she goes. But I thought that was like very typical of like a natural beekeeping way of thinking about your bees. So I really liked that. Another thing is that, as I said, I try to harvest only surplus honey. So I'm not over harvesting. I'm always under harvesting so that the bees have more to eat. Does anybody have any questions about natural beekeeping, or is curious about more? That was just kind of natural beekeeping in a nutshell. No? Okay, no problem.
There is one question from Jessica regarding sourcing bees.
Okay.
She's wondering, if I set up a beehive, is it at all likely native bees will just move in?
The answer actually is no. I mean, well, maybe I'm not understanding you. So honeybees aren't native bees. So you won't have any actual native bees moving into your honeybee hive. I'm wondering if you're actually asking whether like a swarm of honeybees would possibly move into your hive. And that is possible. Sometimes that happens. But you have to be careful about that, because you would probably want to leave like wax frames in the hive to attract honeybees, but you could also attract a lot of pests instead of attracting honeybees. So if you're just leaving like a hive out there somewhere, and it's kind of all set up, but it doesn't have bees in it, you could attract ants, you could attract mice, you could attract all sorts of things that might want to get in there and chew away on the wax or the foundation. So I wouldn't recommend that as a way to get bees. You also don't know what you'd get. And people often think that, that catching honeybee swarms, which is basically just something that happens when a honeybee colony divides itself in the spring. About half the bees will fly off and find a new home. That's called the swarm. And so people will put out hives and try to catch those swarms because they're free bees. But you can actually end up catching a swarm that carries disease spores that can start a pretty serious infection. And people don't realize that, but it's actually true. So you would need to know how to monitor those bees and watch to make sure they were healthy instead of just thinking that they were going to be healthy.
And Kim, another question, or excuse me, Michelle, a question from Kim. How do you know how much honey, excuse me, how do you know how much honey to leave them through the winter?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really is determined by the size of your colony, the size of your hives. So here, I'm going to show you a picture later that shows beehives that have two that are housed in two boxes, two deep boxes. And for those hives, you'd have to make sure that the whole second box was completely full of honey. So, they could use about 80 pounds, for a Nova Scotia winter. 6 months, the bees need food for 6 months. So it's a good 80 pounds or more. It's a lot. It's really a lot. Some of those questions might make more sense in as we go through like some of the equipment and so forth. But thank you for asking them now, and they're a good segue into the next part of the presentation. Does anybody else have any other questions before we go? No? Okay. So, well, actually, that was a perfect segue because now we're going to hit sort of the more practical part of the presentation. What does beekeeping really involve? Now, some of you are beekeepers, and so, this is going to be kind of old hat for you. But for those of you who are wondering about what it would be like to keep honeybees, or what kind of investment in terms of time and learning and equipment and so forth, then this is where you can ask me all your questions. I am independent from any beekeeping store, and my goal has never been to sell people equipment. In fact, my goal is to help people save money because it can be a really expensive hobby. So even if you have questions about something like that, feel free to ask. So I thought I would just say a little bit about all of these topics. This is going to be a little bit off the cuff for me, just based on the amount of time we have. So Bob, just keep me on track. We'll start talking about, so you'll have to learn about bee biology, which is just amazing, basically. There's a lot of equipment in beekeeping to learn about. Then there's sort of the buying bees. Well, what bees do you buy and what bees do you not buy? And everyone's going to tell you something different. Then there's, how do you set up your apiary? Where do you do it? How do you protect your bees? And then the whole subject of honeybee health, which is totally fascinating. Caring for bees for all seasons, where there's just, there's a lot of little parts and a lot of things to remember and do on time. How much time and labor is this really going to cost you, and how much honey are you going to get? So we'll go through this equation, and hopefully it'll help some of you decide whether or not this is going to fit into your lifestyle. And I hope that for at least some of you, the answer will be yes. Anyway, I could talk for hours about honeybee biology, so I'm going to really rein myself in here. But I mentioned before that a honeybee colony is a superorganism. So it's tens of thousands of bees all relating together as a single organism. And there are 3 different types of bees in a honeybee hive. Most of the hive is made up of female worker bees, which you can see on the left of the photograph. They're the smaller ones. Each colony also has a queen bee, generally just one. She's the mother of the colony. She lays all the eggs. And then we have the male bees, or the drone bees, and they make up maybe 10% of the colony. And all of these bees have very different, they have very different bodies. If you look at them, they have very different anatomy, and that's because they play different roles. And so they need they need to do different functions. And that's something that I really like to go into in my classes, because I think it can really spark a lot of wonder in people, and just kind of like, oh my gosh, I had no idea, that bees had this capability. Like we think of them as being like little insects, or a honeybee colony as being just like a box of insects, but nothing could be further from the truth. They are really sophisticated, and the honeybee brain is like the pinnacle of insect evolution. So learning honeybee biology from someone who loves it is definitely a good foundation for your beekeeping. Another thing that you'll learn about is just how they develop. And then you also need to learn not only how they develop, but then how that helps you to read the colony and ask yourself questions about how they're doing. And that's like another really interesting subject to learn about in order to become a good beekeeper. Now, beekeeping is pretty equipment heavy. There's equipment for everything. And perhaps, the first question that people start off with is just, well, what type of hive do I want to get? Because there are different types. The ones that I have here are like the hives you see in farmers' fields. They're called Langstroth hives. I keep bees in Langstroth hives because I wanted to harvest honey. This is like the honey producing hive. But other people prefer to work with the top bar hives, which are more like the horizontal log hives that you would see or they're based on like the horizontal log hives from Africa. And there's a lot less lifting involved with the top bars, but they also don't produce as much honey. So there are pros and cons to everything, and also even different sizes of different hives to consider. There are also like a lot of tools for working with the bees, for actually entering the hive to do that safely. There's equipment associated with feeding bees, and that's like a whole big subject in natural beekeeping about, well, when should you feed? When should you not feed? Some people are very black and white about it, whereas I tend to be just kind of realistic. I don't like to feed my bees, but sometimes I have to. Then there's also all the protective clothing, which is more personal. Then there's also equipment associated with like all the honey harvest, and that kind of relates back to the style of hive that you bought. And then there's seasonal equipment as well. So when I teach courses, I always think that this should be the most straightforward section of the course, and yet all the other topics kind of relate back to equipment. So you have to make sure that you get everything really clear. And I really like helping people decide what's going to work best for them, because I think it's something that you have to be realistic about. And then we had that question earlier about, well, how can I get bees? There are different ways to get bees. There are different places to get bees, and there are different types of bees that you can buy. So for me, it's just keeping it local, buying directly from beekeepers who I know have really good local bee stocks, and not buying the imported queens, wherever I can avoid it. And I pretty much actually never buy imported queens, but I'm also willing to drive a longer distance to get a local queen. I think that's something that helps my apiary succeed. So there are lots of options here. And then, you also have to register your honeybee colonies with Nova Scotia, and that's free. And that's something that's really important in case the provincial apiarist has to get in touch with beekeepers in a certain area. In terms of setting up your apiary, people do this in different ways. These are your bee yards. You might be able to keep them on your own property or in your own backyard. But if you don't think you have the right conditions where you live, you might actually be able to keep your bees at somebody else's place, as long as it's not too far away. I've actually always had to keep my bees on other people's properties. I've just never had a backyard that really let me keep as many as I wanted to. And so I drive a lot, and I'd say you don't want to keep your bees any further than 25 minutes away, because it really adds a lot to every time you have to go to inspect. But the flip side is you're kind of sharing the joy. So the people, who have let me keep bees on their properties have always really enjoyed having them. And so, you meet people that way as well, which is nice. There are also different ways to think about how to set them up. And also you'll want to think about, what's legal. For example, if you're keeping bees in the city, you'll want to think about whether your lot size will legally allow you to do that. And and if you live outside the city, you'll want to think about protecting your hives from bears and things like that. So a lot goes into setting up a good apiary, but that's something that's fun to learn about too. My favorite topic, however, is honeybee health. This is what I'm really passionate about, partly because I am an ecologist and I really don't want my honeybees to impact wild bee populations negatively. So when I teach about honeybee health, I really like to start from a place of health, just like, how would your honeybees look and sound and smell if they were really thriving, and just like get that picture into your head, really kind of know what you're looking to, know the conditions and know the results of good conditions for your bees. And then how do you keep them that way? It's all about prevention. It's about setting them up so that they can be healthy and then preventing them from getting sick. And so there are a lot of parasites and pests and diseases to learn about, but that's not impossible. It's actually morbidly fascinating. And some of them are really contagious and deadly. So, this is not something you can skip over. It's really not something you can skip over. I mean, this is probably the number one reason why people lose their honeybee colonies. And then, of course, you need to learn how to regularly monitor and treat honeybees if that's something that you need to do. So lots of interesting learning there.
Eva has a question she put in the chat box. Eva, maybe
Thanks.
you could just jump in and ask your question about bee health.
Great.
Okay. Well, I am familiar with the, I guess, more traditional methods for treating pests once they have infected a hive or a colony. Things like varroa mites, for example, because that seems to be one of the more common parasites, at least the one that everybody talks about until there's an emergency with something worse. And so I know that there are plenty of prevention methods, and that probably the best thing to do is just to keep your apiary well monitored and, just really, really know your bees so that you can tell when something's going wrong or beginning to, so that you can stop it from getting worse. But in terms of the different types of treatments, most of what I'm aware of are things like strips of pesticides that can be placed inside of the bee boxes, for example. And in some cases, like weather dependent, of course, there's also like a type of fogging that one can do with similar chemicals that will kill off all of the mites. But I mean, really, I'm hoping that there are other effective ways to treat these problems that aren't, I guess, as potentially toxic.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Does that make any sense? Because I don't even really know if there are, because this seems to be the most common accepted way of dealing with mites. And certainly I personally am not willing to experiment with something unless, well, it wouldn't be an experiment if I knew it worked. I just want to know what works, because I don't feel like it's my place to experiment with something like that. So
yeah, that's a great question. So just to give people a backstory, Eva is talking about a parasite called the varroa mites, which basically every colony in the world pretty much has at this point. The only two places in the world that don't have varroa mites are Australia and Newfoundland. But all of the bee colonies that you purchase from Nova Scotia, well, basically all the colonies you purchase that aren't coming from Australia will have varroa mites. So they're ubiquitous. And it's a parasite that the honeybees haven't been exposed to for a very long period of time. And so the mites are really virulent, and they kill honeybee colonies if you don't monitor and treat them, or just not knock the population of mites back. The mites also carry a lot of viruses. And in fact, this little bee in the photo has something called deformed wing virus, which is carried by the mites. So it's a pretty serious topic. And And also, I think one of the main reasons why people lose their bees is because they're really confused about how to work with varroa mites. And it's just like any other subject where you literally hear like 10 different things and you're like, well, this person says I'm not supposed to treat. This person says I absolutely have to treat. This person says you use this product. This person says, no, you don't use products. You're supposed to make your own. This person says this, and I think I try to approach it from a gentle and realistic and science-based perspective. When I first started keeping bees, I was really determined that I was going to be as natural and treatment-free as possible. I'm an ecologist. I like organic vegetables. That's where I was coming from. And so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to use sugar. These people are talking about just dusting their bees with sugar. That sounds fine. And I very quickly realized that it was disruptive to the bees. That using sugar, which sounded like such a natural way to treat them, was really disruptive and didn't really work within the very short season that we have in Nova Scotia, and didn't really work for how else I needed to monitor or how else I wanted to work with the hive so they were actually producing some honey that I could sell. And so I was like, oh, wow, that's funny. That didn't really work. And so then I thought, okay, I knew there were some products out there that did have kind of a longer standing or maybe like a chemical structure that would leave residues in the hive, and I didn't want to use those. So what I do now is I use the more natural products, and I use products that won't integrate into the wax. So I'll use things like a product that's based on thyme oil, or I'll use the organic acid-based products because they're very effective against mites, but they don't leave residues in the colony. And they don't leave, and because they're not leaving any residues, you don't have to worry about them leaving any residues like in the honey boxes or in the honey. So I've basically taken that road where realistically, as a small scale beekeeper, I need to treat my bees. I don't have an isolated apiary with 100 colonies, where I can run big experiments where I don't treat my bees and I let most of them die and I just raise bees from the survivors. That's not the context that I'm in. That's not the context that any of you will be in. You're going to have probably smaller apiaries. You're going to want your hives to survive from year to year instead of having them die on you all the time. So then it's like taking that middle road where you're being really judicious and careful about what you use in your hive. You're applying it properly. You're making sure that it wipes out the parasites, the mites, and you're letting your bees continue healthily year after year. So that's the way I work with it. There really is no other way at this point. Like you really have to treat the mites, otherwise your colony is going to die. And there's nothing, and it's just, I do this not just for my own bees, but knowing that if I'm not managing the mites, then more mites are going to spread to other people's colonies. More disease is going to spread to wild bee populations. And I don't want that to happen. So I just I realized that I couldn't be so black and white about it. And I use the least, the products I use are not toxic. They're toxic to the mites. You want them to kill the mites, but they're not toxic to the colony and they don't leave residue.
Yeah.
So that's how I do it.
As far as I'm concerned, not treating is not an option.
No, it's really not. Yeah, it's really not.
The way that I see it is that in order to protect not just my own bees, because I don't have a large apiary either. I only have 3 colonies basically, but so it's small and that's all that my area can handle. But I know that, I didn't want to try something that was not going to be effective, because it's not just my bees that will be affected by anything that I slip up with as a beekeeper. those mites that may be on my bees and infecting them can be deposited on flowers
Yeah.
that are between myself and someone else's apiary. So, you know, and then that is how another colony will get infected if I don't treat. So it's not really an option. But I guess, like, just aside from the major well-known types of chemicals, I was hoping that there would be other options, and you're indicating that there is. So that's really good news. I'm not interested in using something that is not scientifically backed.
Yeah,
There's just
yeah.
too much at risk
Yeah,
to really
I think
play
so
with
too.
that
I think so
ideologically,
too.
even, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's where I'm coming from. Thank you. I think that was
Okay.
addressed.
Yeah.
And I could jump in here, Michelle, if you don't mind, with a fascinating side story.
Mhm.
I was talking with my sister in Indiana.
Oh,
She
good.
had-
Yes.
Yeah, she has a small apiary. She had to requeen one of her hives.
Uh-huh.
She drove a little ways to a queen breeder who is working with some people at Purdue University,
Mm,
a breeding program
yes.
underway with a type of bees that have learned to bite the legs off of mice.
Yes. The Purdue ankle biters. That's what they're called.
They're called ankle biter bees. Yeah. And so they're slowly propagating them into other breeders, and it's getting around. So keep an eye out for ankle biter bees.
Yes. I mean, one of the downsides of living in Canada is that we don't have access to all these different bee stocks because they're generally being developed in the States and elsewhere. I think we do have there is a strain of bees in Saskatchewan, which are supposed to be more resistant to varroa mites, but most of the really cool strains are being developed down south. And so part of keeping bees in Atlantic Canada is just understanding that you need to do your best with what's available here. Yeah, but that is great. Yeah, they have the best name, the Purdue ankle biters. That's very cute. So I have just a couple more slides here. I want to just say a few things about caring for bees in all seasons, and just say, all 4 seasons have their unique tasks. Obviously here we don't have to do very much during the winter, other than maybe, you might want to clean up your equipment and so forth and get it ready for the next spring. Most of the care for honeybees here in Nova Scotia is from April through October. And it's kind of like the ends of the seasons that are like the busiest. So you'll find a lot of beekeeping work is concentrated in May, and then mid-August and September as well. And so when you're thinking about whether honeybees will kind of work within your lifestyle, you just want to make sure that you're around those times a year and that you don't have like too many other major commitments, so that you will actually have time to go out and take care of your bees. People often ask about how much time beekeeping takes, and that is the hardest question for me to answer. I'm very diligent with my bees, and so I probably spend a bit more time with them than most other people do. Beekeeping is also a craft. It's not really a checklist. Depends on the season. But what you will consider is that you're going to be inspecting your colony every 9 to 12 days. You may have some time spent, traveling to the hive. You're going to have some time spent learning about bees, consulting with people. If there's a problem, even just learning whether your bees are okay. I mean, that can sort of take up your, the bulk of your first season, and learning how to handle them and so forth. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm just outlining for you kind of what's involved, but I probably spend more time than most people do. So beekeeping is not a fast project. It's it's certainly not a source of cheap or easy honey. And generally when we keep bees, we say that for the first year, the hive is just developing for itself. You're just raising a healthy colony. You're not looking to harvest any honey in the first year. And, maybe allowing the bees to grow a little bit more and for the colony to build a little bit more in the second season, you might start getting a little bit of honey. So you have to be kind of patient with it and know that, you're going to be doing this for 2 or 3 years. maybe by the third year, you're going to start feeling a little bit more competent with it, and it'll be like third or fourth year often, when people start to feel like they've got a harvest coming, and they have a sense of what to do and what not to do. So there is a lot to learn and put together. And the learning is it's just really fun. As I said, they're very beautiful insects. They're really fascinating. And, everybody will have their stories about what's the best thing about beekeeping, what's the worst thing about beekeeping, or hardest thing. Well, worst thing, let's be honest. For me, the best thing is being out in the summer, like on a beautiful day when the bees are just really calm and happy and they're really productive, and just watching them come and go from the colony. They're just like bringing in pollen and nectar. And there's just this, like, I don't know, it's just this lovely, they just kind of like almost like hover in front of the colony while they wait for like a chance to land and go in. And it's really satisfying. It's just really, really beautiful. And for me, the hardest thing about beekeeping is actually the physical labor. So I just want to say that because it is really important to make sure that you're not getting into a type of hive that's going to be too much for you to work with physically. I have injured my back. I had a good back before I started beekeeping, let's put it that way. The last thing I just want to let you know about is that I do teach. I've been teaching about natural beekeeping for many years in the HRM. I have a course called Natural Beekeeping 101. And this is the first year I'm going to run it so that people can take it over the holidays. Because that's when people have time, right? You're sitting around, you're visiting family, you need a bit of a break or something. So I'm actually going to run a holiday edition of Natural Beekeeping 101. And it's a really comprehensive course. It's something that I add to every year. So it'll be a series of like videos and very short readings, includes some PDF guides, also includes some live Q&A, which happens in the new year. And if you feel so inclined to learn about bees and you think that that would fit into your schedule, one nice thing about learning online is that you can include your whole household. I know people who like to watch the videos with their children, for example, and you have repeated access, so you can go back and take notes and so forth, and then you can talk to me in the new year and get your questions answered. So if that's something that interests you, oh, I forgot I was going to show you. I think the thing that when you hear online courses, my fear is always that it's going to be like really, I don't know, boring or ugly to look at. So just wanted to show you what the interface looks like. So it's very clear, it's colorful, and very organized, easy to use. And there you go. That's my website. Whether you want to look up courses or just send me, shoot me an email to ask me a question, you're very welcome to do that. And I have if you want to learn about beekeeping, I have a little holiday discount on as well. So feel free to share that or check it out. And please ask me more questions for the rest of the time we have.
I do want to jump in for everyone. I did have a great opportunity to take the course, my wife and I, from Michelle, and I have to say it was fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, each of the courses, it's a kind of like tonight, only each of those slides is a one of the courses one of the sessions in itself. So it's a very deep dive into everything that she just touched on tonight. But it goes way deeper, and huge opportunity to ask a lot of questions, whether you're going to be going into bees for the very first time or have been at it for a number of years. We've been at it for 5, 6, 7 years now, and all kinds of things. You're always learning, I swear.
You're always learning. Yeah, I'm always learning. That's actually one of the reasons I love teaching so much, is because I learn from the people I'm teaching. Yeah.
There's always something new that happens, something unexpected. I was talking about my sister in Indiana. I had never seen wax moths before.
Oh,
You hear
oh, did you
about
get
them.
wax moths?
Yeah,
Oh.
she had wax moths. I like, oh my God, and I knew about it because of your course.
Yes.
You know, yeah, and there
You're
it was.
like, ew, they're as gross as they were. They're even
Yeah.
grosser than Michelle said they were.
You see tiny little caterpillars, crawling around on the mite board, which usually you're just looking for mites and there's little things moving around and what the heck is that? Yeah. So always learning something new, and it really helped to have that background kind of exposure of just about everything, all the different diseases, different kinds of equipment, feeding. That's a whole nother,
Yeah,
still,
it's like a whole topic in itself. Yeah.
it is when to feed, should you feed, how much.
Yeah.
I've got other beekeepers now asking me like I'm an expert, but
Great. Good.
No.
Well, you took the course. Yeah.
Oh.
You're like, let me go check.
Wow. Yeah.
Actually, I've had quite a few people take the course, even though they've been beekeeping for several years. And yeah, and they said they were really happy with what they learned. So it's, I think it's organized enough for a newbie, for someone who's doing it new. And of course, you can go back and watch different recordings more than once. But there's definitely some content in there for people who have kept bees for a while too.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
Paul's got a very interesting question.
Oh, great.
He said, how does it feel to be amidst a swarm of bees?
Oh, that's a great question.
Does it seem like they adjust to your moods? If you're ever in a rushed, agitated state, perhaps, do they find that your mood causes the bees to become agitated?
Bees are very sensitive to our energy. Yes, they are. I think maybe I would say they would read mood or be sensitive to mood just by how it affects our actions. If we're in a hurry, if we're just kind of like really in our heads that day and just trying to do something quickly, or, we're still thinking about what happened at work and we're just not being very present with them, often we'll be kind of clumsy or we'll be a little rough, we'll drop things. The bees definitely react to that. So a colony is a good mirror in that sense, definitely. And what was the other one? It was about.
Oh, with.
Sorry. There's a huge question here from. Oh, that was Eva's response to Paul. Okay, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, what was the other one? It was like the mood of the bees, and what's it like to be in a swarm of bees? It's really beautiful, actually. It's actually less dramatic than you'd think it would be. It's just like the air has a lot of bees. Like there are like just a lot of bees circling around, like much more than usual. It's not like a dense cloud of bees. It's just like a lot of bees circling around. And, like the sun is, their bodies are, catching the sun. So there's like little glints in the air, they're not, you can hear it, there's a lot of buzzing, but it's like a gentle sound. And, it's just really beautiful. You can just stand there and they'll just fly around you. They're not trying to defend anything. They're just they're out and about. They're trying to locate the scent of their queen. They're trying to follow her and stay together. And it's pretty beautiful. It also happens very quickly. Like you could miss it if you weren't there at the 5 minutes that it happened. So, but it is actually quite lovely to see. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, we had a swarm leave one of our hives.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this huge cloud over about a 30, 40 foot area. You could hear it. That's what drew us out there from the house. Is you could
That's right. Yes.
The sound was amazing. And you see this cloud, and then very slowly it started to coalesce onto a tree branch. Yeah, I don't know if the queen lands there first and then they all clump around her.
Usually, yeah.
Exactly
Yeah,
how it happens. But then, there had to be 10,000 bees hanging on a tree branch.
Mm-hmm.
And so we said, well, let's see if we can capture it. So we're up there with with a ladder. I'm holding my
Oh,
son's
man.
holding the ladder. He's trying to cut the branch off. You know, he hands the branch down to me, which is now kind of heavy with all these bees on it. But, you know, we weren't in a panic because I've always heard, like from your course and elsewhere, that they're about as tame as can be when they're in a swarm.
Yeah.
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 Now we do have a question. Glenn, you've got your hand up, I see. If you've got a question, please go ahead. You have to come off mute. Are you able to come? Oh, there we go.
How's that?
Hey,
Good.
Glenn.
Yeah, hi, Michelle. Sorry about that. I'm not really good at all this
No problem.
electronic stuff, and especially on a little tablet. Michelle, I understand 100% everything you said about the love of the bees, because it's only really people like us, I think, that really understand. No, I shouldn't say that. Don't understand bees. I have to get to straighten myself out here. I have right now, I have 3 top bar hives and 1 Langstroth hive.
Great.
I go into the hive most of the time without anything on veil or anything. But like you said earlier, it depends on what your mood is, because I certainly can sense the mood. The other important thing is talking to them. You always need to talk to your bees and say hi to the girls and things like that.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier, we have a large vegetable garden, and that was one of the bigger reasons why I got the bees, besides the fact that I love bees. 4 or 5 years now, I've had these hives. They've waxed and waned, lost some hives through the winter, gained some extras, did splits, et cetera, et cetera. My question is, though, excuse me, I know the top bar hives that I started with, I didn't want bees for honey. That would have been a bonus if I got those.
Yep. Yep.
Then a little bit later on, I thought, well, gee, you know, maybe I should get a Langstroth hive in order to get some honey. So I got a Langstroth hive. Still never got any honey for the last 2 years from that Langstroth hive. The bees are fine, healthy, treating for varroa mite with formic acid most of the time. No problems there. But here's the thing. So come the honey flow or the nectar flow in the spring, they start gathering it. Lovely to see. They start capping it. I get about my frames about half capped, and the rest of it is still being dehydrated. And I go back in the hive about a week or so later, and that honey's gone. So I have that capped honey and the nectar is gone. So obviously the bees are eating it, and I have no idea why that would be. And it's happening both in my Langstroth and my top bar hives. I have managed to harvest maybe 2 or 3 frames every summer of my top bar hive and just cut it off, as you know, wax it all, mash it, strain it through the strainer to get a little bit of honey, just to say I got some, because it's very embarrassing when people ask you why you're buying honey and you got honeybees, right? So, but they don't understand the way we do, Michelle.
Yeah.
So my first guess would be is that there's not enough nectar flow in my area. But all my neighbors see my bees all over their flowers. They love it too. We have a large vegetable garden, like I mentioned earlier, plus lots of flowers that we researched and got the kinds of flowers that the bees like. But the bees never go to those ones. They go to the wild ones instead. They're very frustrating ladies most of the time, but it's all part of the intrigue. And catching a swarm too, by the way, Robert and Paul, that's wonderful. Climbing up ladders and stuff, and then getting them, and then they leave, and then you get them again. That's all wonderful too.
It's like
anyway,
a sport.
Michelle, yeah. I don't want to hold up because there's lots of other people here, but what's your comment on that? Why can I not get any harvestable honey?
Where are you located?
Glen Haven in St. Margaret's Bay area.
Okay.
Past Cantal on the way to Piggy's Cove. In the woods.
In the woods. Okay.
Well, in a remote, in a rural type atmosphere. Yeah.
I would need to see the environment, but my sense is that, I mean, honeybees make a lot of honey when they're in meadows, when they're in meadows, when they're in fields of crops. That's where honeybees collect a lot of nectar. And I absolutely love the St. Margaret's Bay area. I mean, it's just incredibly beautiful. But my sense of just driving through it and in different places is that it wouldn't be a big honey landscape.
Mm.
I mean, certainly you do have a lot of wildflowers around, but you don't really have like meadows of wildflowers, unless there are maybe like a few tucked away here and there, you know, along secondary roads or highways, but that would be very localized. But I think you can, so you've been at this for many years, and I mean, you're working with top bars and Langstroth, and you're seeing the same different thing. Obviously, the bees are eating it. I'm guessing that that's kind of when we get like those periods in June where it suddenly gets cool again and kind of rainy, and the bees start eating through the honey that they've gathered and made. So I think for you, it might be a matter of experimenting with a different hive configuration on your Langstroth. So for example, even though the standard tends to be to use 2 deep boxes, you know, for a Langstroth colony, you might experiment with whether you can, you know, successfully run a single box Langstroth hive, you know, and basically just have 1 brood box and then put honey supers on top of that. So for example, what you could do is you could overwinter the bees in a deep box plus 1 medium, which gives them a little bit less space, but you'll be raising smaller colonies, so they won't need as much honey. And with like, if you sort of think about like a deep box plus a medium as being like your winter standard, then maybe the following spring it's just a matter of putting 1 more medium box on top, and that becomes your honey super. And even 1 honey super gives a lot of honey, you know, like that's like 10, 12 liters of honey.
Okay,
That's
I
a
am running a 2 deep brood, and then I usually, and then when the flow is on, I usually put the queen excluder on, and then of course a medium on top of that.
So you may
Sorry,
find that out in St. Margaret's Bay, you may find that maybe your colonies do better in smaller brood boxes, and maybe that gives you, you know, a way to add, you know, a medium as a honey super that they actually fill up, that you can then harvest. That's what I would do if I lived in a landscape that wasn't very, very rich, is I would keep smaller colonies and spaces in a configuration that would more easily allow me to do a harvest.
Okay. Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, Michelle, it's sort of, it doesn't matter so much. I just like having the bees. They're just pets. They're just like 200,000 pets I have here in the yard. And it costs me a lot of money in the fall for sugar and making up fondant boards and things like that in order to get them through the winter. But hey, then the spring comes, and when they start emerging from in the spring, then you can feel pretty darn good. And then you sit around watching your bees fly around, and life is good again. And so you buy your honey from local beekeepers, and
who live in a different place.
Oh yeah. Okay, thank you, Michelle.
Glenn,
Glenn, feel free to email me if you want more, if you want to talk about that idea more of just going to a different hive configuration, because I've recommended that to a couple of people in St. Margaret's Bay.
Okay.
I think Bob and Susan might do that actually.
Yeah, Glenn, we are in St. Margaret's Bay, and my wife describes our bees as coastal forest bees, which basically means they just have to work harder. They got to go a little further for foraging. So it's rare that we get honey to save. We do sometimes, you know, if it's a good season. And year by year, we're planting more different kinds of flowers around our yard and on the property for the bees. Different types of flowers that bloom different times of the year. So they're able to gather nectar pretty much all year, and that really seems to help as well.
Yeah, well, we'll continue to do that too. They're very hardy bees here down on the South Shore, and yeah, they're very hardy. I picked up a swarm down on Tancock Island, actually. I've never seen such hardy bees in my life. They come out in the winter flying around. They're incredible bees. But anyway, thank you. I will be in touch, Michelle.
Sounds good, Glenn.
Another question, Michelle, from Kim. Do you ever run in-person courses for new beekeepers?
Yeah, Kim, I have in the past. That's actually how I started teaching. But I went more online kind of as the pandemic happened. So I think this winter I'm still deciding whether I'm going to chance trying to organize an in-person course or not. I haven't decided. I think I probably will want to see just, I want to make sure that Nova Scotia, the people are still okay about gathering and so forth. So I may do one this winter or this spring, but I'm not really sure.
And there's a fascinating chat going on in the chat box about bananas. Yeah, bananas and beehives don't mix. Is that what we hear?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I hear people say that. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I've heard people say that, the alarm pheromone that's released by honeybees when, they want to alert their sisters to some sort of disruption of the hive, smells like bananas or, has a similar chemical makeup to bananas. But to be honest, I've never smelled that. I mean, my colonies are pretty gentle. I mean, but sometimes they get a little upset. I mean, obviously I get stung sometimes. I eat bananas all the time, and I eat bananas on the way to my honeybees, and I personally have never noticed any problems. But then you hear people who swear by it, so I'm not sure what to say. Different bees do different things. Yeah.
Okay, we're coming to a close here. Any last questions, comments, experiences from anyone? Feel free to jump in.
Paul's already talking about using a smoker and so forth. That's true. Yep, that's definitely some of the equipment you need to buy. Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Michelle, when you were talking about the pastures or the meadows in Cole Harbor, how big is that? Are you a lot of time or like an acre, half an acre?
You know what, Bill? I'm having trouble making it out. Are you able to write in the chat box at all?
Yeah, I've got a really bad microphone. Let me do that.
I think I heard the words Cole Harbor, but I didn't hear anything else.
Yeah, Bill, people not back.
Oh, how big is a meadow? An acre of dandelion infested lawn. Awesome. That's okay. Gosh, how big is a meadow? The meadows that my bees were in are pretty big. Like definitely those would be acres. Those would be acres for those meadows. An acre of dandelion infested lawn. That's promising. Bees like dandelions. That's a good size. If you were ever interested in like converting some of that over to like pollinator habitat or something like that, then I'd be happy to see if I could hook you up with some resources. Do they harvest anything from trees? Yes. Honeybees do harvest from trees. They harvest saps from trees and from other plants. And that's what we call propolis, actually. So the bees bring back the sap from the tree or the plant back to the hive. They kind of mix it with a little bit of wax, and they use it to plaster the entrances and any cracks or any chinks in between frames and so forth. And it actually makes up a really significant part of the honeybee's colony immune system, because propolis is, has antibacterial and antiviral properties, and it's a pretty significant component of how honeybee colonies maintain their health. Propolis, yes, propolis is from, well, trees or plants. I mean, the bees would get it from a number of different sources. So I mean, I can't break down exactly, what my bees are gathering from, but it smells incredible. Wow, I mean, it just smells amazing. Yeah, it smells. I have to say, I mean, apiculture is the best smelling form of agriculture. It just smells gorgeous.
Well,
Yeah.
Michelle, I want to thank you. I think we're just about out of time. It's been fascinating presentation and discussion. Great questions from everybody.
Mhm.
Always good to talk about bees. I do want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and I want to encourage you to sign up, go to our website, sign up for the newsletter. There's a lot of upcoming events. On December 2nd, community show and tell handmade holidays, how to make those
Oh, nice.
instead of going out and buying them. Then in February, we're going to be talking about planting seeds and growing microgreens. And then get this, speaking of dandelions, in April, just as the dandelions are starting to bloom, we've got guest celebrity chef David Wimberly going to take us through a number of great dandelion recipes for cooking in the kitchen.
That's awesome. Right on.
Okay, so sign up for our newsletter and you'll be able to hear all about it.
Sounds great. It was so nice to be here, everybody. I really appreciate you coming out this evening. And yeah, feel free to stay in touch. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're so welcome.
Michelle, that was great.
Yeah, I'm really pleased so many people came. You did a great job of promoting it.
Well,
Really nice.
And I'm glad your voice hung in there. Sounded like you're
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot better, but I knew that talking a lot, I'd probably end up having a bit of trouble. Anyway, no problem.
You made it. It was great.
Yeah. How's Susan feeling? Is she healing up her pneumonia?
She's back to 100%.
Good. That means I need to bring the puppy out to meet you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. She'd love that. Thanks very much, Bob. It was really fun. Hope to see you guys soon. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.